Okay.
Oh, here we go. Perfect. Yeah, my name is Chad. Thank you all so much for having me. I've been somewhat uh, connected to SD 350. At least, I've been keeping up with the work that y'all are doing. And so it's so nice to be here with you all and get to engage with you all more directly. I recently graduated from the University of San Francisco. I was studying international studies, and kind of within that umbrella, I came across degrowth, and it became one of the central components of my research. And so happy to be here and explore some of the foundational things degrowth has to offer. And yeah, Anne.
Thanks, and it's good to see so many familiar faces. I'm probably met me before because I'm pretty active in San Diego 350. But also at the same time, I'm doing a master's in degrowth, just finishing that up, starting to work on my thesis. So here we are. And yeah, and just welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Chad and I are excited to have this conversation with you about some of the core themes of degrowth. We will be sharing the slides later, which will include all our references and some additional notes and even some bonus slides. But let's get into it. So next.
Yeah, so we'd like to start with an opening question because I'm sure many of you have heard the term, or if you haven't heard the term, we'd like to ask what you think about when you hear the word degrowth, and feel free to jot it in the chat.
Thanks, John, for being the first one, repairability. Oh, the end of civilization as we know it. That's really daunting. Reuse. Right? Not measuring the success of the economy in terms of continuous cancerous growth. Smart degrowth, yeah. All right, we'll give you another. It seems like we're okay. Either people are shy or thinking a lot. Okay, here we go. The easy way or the hard way, yeah. Moving away from a model of economic success is growth. Find nothing. Growth as a Ponzi scheme. That's a good one. You could say critical things too. These seem to be all. So that's totally fine. Reducing consumption within planetary limits. Someone's been doing their homework. Slowing down or halting habitat destruction. A bit like defund. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Defend. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, you can continue to put things in the chat as oh yeah. Yeah. A better definition is needed. Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. Okay, but I'll move on. So next slide. So we did. So when we were putting this presentation together, some people asked why we were doing giving a climate chat on this topic at all. So we thought it'd be good to spend some time addressing that at the beginning. For many people in the environmental movement, this is the first time they've ever heard. The first time they've ever heard of the word degrowth was when the latest IPCC report came out last year. And the report doesn't necessarily go into too much depth about degrowth, but it does mention it briefly in several areas of the report. So here are some quotes from the report that you can read. The report does highlight some studies that show that degrowth is necessary to stay within a target of 2 degrees warming. It also shows that degrowth pathways may be crucial, especially if we want to also hit the UN social development goals. and that degrowth can help with speeding up transformation and shifting to low carbon intensive lifestyles. Next.
Yeah, so as Anne just pointed out with the IPCC report, degrowth has found its way into popular discourse or into sustainability discourse. And it has been a point of exploration for really decades. But in recent years, there's been a marked increase in coverage by media outlets about the topic. So while degrowth has been a topic within academic circles, it has now found its way into a more public discourse. The co-founder of 350.org even wrote an article exploring this very issue, and he has made it known in this article that he's quite sympathetic to the core principles of degrowth. This topic, however, as was mentioned in the chat, can be quite polarizing, given the fact that it challenges some of the foundational characteristics of capitalism as it is currently functioning. So with all this in mind, we thought it would be a good time to engage with the topic directly to understand the points degrowth offers. And our goal is to present the key critiques, the key themes, and discuss if and how it can inform our approach to sustainable development in San Diego and perhaps the US more broadly. Next slide, please.
And before moving on, we also want to say something about wording. So when we've talked to people in the past about degrowth, we often found that people will like the concept, but absolutely hate the word. So if you find yourself already bristling at this word, that's fine. You're in good company. In fact, we found that there are lots of ways of thinking about economic and social transitions that don't like to call themselves degrowth, but do share a similar approach, or at least take a more agnostic view of growth. So here are just some examples where people use different terms, but they all are at least somewhat critical of economic growth or understand it as getting in the way of our ecological and social goals. Next. So finally, we get to defining what exactly degrowth is. And so how we're defining it here as a democratic and equitable reduction of excess resource and energy use that leads to well-being for all within ecological limits. And we'll be looking at these 5 components in more depth in the presentation. Next. So the first thing we're going to look at is ecological limits. And I suspect most of you are familiar with this image, but basically it shows that there are at least 9 planetary boundaries, which if crossed, increase the risk of irreversible ecological damage. Some of these boundaries involve the rate at which humans are using natural resources, such as the conversion of natural land for human use or the consumption of fresh water. And then other boundaries have to do with the rate at which the Earth can absorb waste products, such as greenhouse gas emissions or novel entities, which is just another name for chemical pollution. Humanity is currently crossing at least 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. The boundary for aerosol loading, which is air pollution, hasn't been determined yet. Next slide. Another way to look at humanity's impact on the world is through our material footprint. So just like the UN has a panel looking at climate change, it also has a panel to study material use. So these charts show global material footprint, which is basically defined as the consumption of raw materials. The chart on the left shows the absolute growth, and the chart on the right shows the growth per capita. So extracting more minerals, consuming more fossil fuels, growing more food, which sounds great, except a third of that is wasted, and then using more land to do all of that, in addition to also producing more waste. According to the UN, the global material footprint has risen 70% since 2000 and 113% since 1990. And what this means is that our material footprint is increasing faster than both population growth and economic output. Next slide. And what this graph shows is that there's a connection between our material footprint, carbon emissions, and GDP. We can see that the material footprint in purple tracks very well with GDP, which is in orange. So much so when there's a dip in one of them, there's a dip in the other, which we can see in this chart at around the year 2009. Carbon emissions, which is the green line, also tracks the material footprint in GDP. You can see that there's a slight divergence, which has been brought about through moving to cleaner energy, but it's still following the same pattern and subject to that same dip. Next. And then when we look more closely at the rate of carbon emissions, we see several things in this chart. One, emissions are constantly going up, even though the goal for them is to get to zero. Two, the only time there has been a decrease in emissions, where the line goes down, is during a global crisis, which is obviously something we try to avoid. And three, each time there has been a dip, there has been a rebound shortly afterward. This also happened after the COVID pandemic, although this is not shown in this chart. Even though emissions decrease during these periods, these are often tragic events where more people experience hardships, such as job losses and cuts in social services. This is clearly not something we want to happen, but it does raise the question of how we get the benefits of lowering emissions that have historically only come with these periods of change without having any of the negative effects. What we want to make clear is that what this chart shows are not examples of degrowth. Sometimes you'll hear this in the media, that degrowth is like a recession, but a recession is actually an unplanned retraction of economic activity within an economic structure that requires expansion and growth and doesn't consider or value human well-being. Next.
So replacing GDP as a metric and policy goal is the first practical initiative we will explore that degrowth advocates for, and has clearly lined out the correlation between GDP rise and the rise in ecological stress and degradation. So in this sense, of course, GDP is inadequate and flawed. It omits the environmental implications of a perpetually growing economy. It also neglects important initiatives and public policy that would enhance the well-being of the environment and of society, which we'll explore a little bit more further. And the fact of the matter is that GDP was never even meant to be an indicator of economic health. Simon Kuznets, the creator of GDP, stated that, quote, "the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from this metric," end quote. So the degrowth position is that other metrics must be used, and an example is the genuine progress indicator. Next slide. The genuine progress indicator incorporates factors that GDP omits to determine the overall health of the economy in its functioning and in its impact. For example, environmental degradation will decrease the rating of GPI, along with income inequality and other factors. And you can see the stark difference in the results GDP gives compared to GPI in this graph here. This graph implies, and researchers note, that at a certain point, GDP no longer correlates with economic welfare. Next slide. And the reality is that countries across the world are already using different metrics. Particularly avant-garde is Bhutan's metric of gross national happiness, which is a far more holistic way of measuring economic and societal health. Policy passed has to first be interrogated from various perspectives that consider the holistic development of individuals, communities, and takes into account ecological sustainability. Next slide. So, as stated, GDP only measures the size of the economy as it pertains to the goods and services it produces, and unfortunately omits key areas of our human experience that would bolster our well-being. For example, social improvements that would come from an increase in public transportation, which would reduce cars and decrease pollution, which is clearly a problem for San Diego and other major metropolitan areas. An increase in public transportation would actually decrease GDP. Public health care would also decrease GDP. And on the other hand, GDP would actually increase as these public services are cut. Additionally, there is evidence that well-being in general and some might say happiness, plateaus once GDP hits a certain point. And I'll reference Bill McKibben here, the co-founder of 350.org. In his article, he states that, quote, "There's little evidence that all this extra consumption has made us particularly satisfied, and more than a sneaking suspicion that it's done the opposite," end quote. Next slide, please. So clearly, GDP as a metric for well-being is flawed in many respects, and this is tied to key assumptions of the current paradigm, which at its core characterizes the human person as homo economicus, a self-interested individual that is motivated primarily by their own passions and desires for wealth and luxury. What assumptions then do degrowthers present as foundational to generating greater well-being? Well, instead of solely emphasizing the financial components, we need to recognize the complexity of the human experience and what it means to truly live well. Instead of constantly seeking to consume and produce more, we need to be intentional about the things we produce individually and collectively. And this is reflected in the concept of conviviality, which I'll touch on a little bit more. Instead of focusing on perpetually increasing GDP, we should facilitate a more equitable distribution of our collective wealth to secure the well-being of individuals, communities, and the environment. And furthermore, our well-being is tied to the well-being of non-human life and the planet's environmental processes, which is a facet of our existence that is often transgressed by unfettered economic activity. And degrowth goes so far as to say that the non-human life and environmental processes have inherent value in and of themselves, and that our system should seek to protect and respect that. Next slide. Back to conviviality here. A major thread within the degrowth movement is the idea of thresholds and conviviality. And I think it's important to just dive a little bit deeper into this briefly, because if you explore degrowth further, you'll almost certainly see it. So conviviality is essentially the argument that we are living at our best when individual autonomy is respected, human creativity is promoted, and we have healthy relationships with our community, the environment, and our human-made tools. In order to achieve this, according to degrowth, we as individuals and collectively need to pay close attention to the social systems and technology we produce in order to protect against the potential harmful effects. Because from the degrowth perspective, if these systems and technology are not kept in check, they will surely begin to work against our well-being and the environment's well-being. So this idea of utilizing technology with discretion to promote greater well-being goes beyond just GDP and would help inform us as we use and attempt to regulate tools and gadgets when they become harmful. Next slide, please. All right, so moving on now to equity. A question that almost always comes up in conversation about degrowth is whether or not everyone should degrow. From the degrowth perspective, the simple answer is no, not everyone needs to degrow in order to achieve sustainability. But because the global north has disproportionately contributed to climate breakdown and the passing of key planetary boundaries, the global north, countries like the US, European nations, these countries definitely need to rein in carbon emissions and material footprint, more so than other parts of the world. According to some scholars, the US alone is responsible for about 40% emissions in excess of safe planetary boundaries. Therefore, according to degrowth, the US is far more responsible for downscaling its emissions than, say, a country like Colombia or Brazil, countries that have far smaller emissions per capita. By doing this, not only will we more effectively address excessive carbon emissions and environmental breakdown, but countries with lower ecological footprints will also have greater space and opportunity to sustainably grow in the manner that is appropriate for their context. Next slide, please. These two graphs here further illustrate the disproportionate consumption rates at a global scale, with high-income nations far surpassing sustainable thresholds. High energy use correlates with high emissions, and high material footprint correlates with high use of elements like freshwater, land use, and minerals, etc. And it's worth noting briefly that while the global north has certainly used more than its fair share in resources, the global south, which in large part has not surpassed sustainable thresholds, they will unfortunately bear the brunt of climate breakdown and other forms of environmental degradation. And just for reference, the lines there, they represent 1.5 degrees Celsius targets. Next slide, please. These patterns at the global level reflect patterns of emissions at the individual level as well, which might be obvious, but I think it's worth showing this graph to highlight that not everyone, even in the global north, is equally responsible for surpassing sustainable thresholds. The wealthy emit far more carbon than the less wealthy, which is why degrowth so strongly advocates for scaling back certain industries like advertisement, private jets, and yachts, to name a few. Next slide, please. And the last point here about equity, aside from making sure that those most responsible for environmental degradation do more to solve it, degrowth also promotes more equitable financial relations between nations. And an important step at the international level from a degrowth perspective is a more just distribution of resources. Many leading scholars in degrowth insist that this is key in any degrowth scenario. And an important method that they propose is the cancellation of debt owed by low-income countries to wealthy countries in the global north. These debts were often facilitated by the World Bank and IMF. By relieving countries of debt, they can better invest in social infrastructure and promote economic trajectories that are sustainable and more effective for their particular context. Next slide, please.
So a fourth component of degrowth is an emphasis on a more engaged democracy, which is also tied to our understanding of well-being. One way to increase democratic participation is to expand both the type and the method of political decision-making. An example of this that has been implemented in several countries are what is called citizens' assemblies. These act on a sort of jury model, but where the goal is to get together a group of people that represent different populations. And then that group uses deliberation or dialogue to generate new ideas, explore and resolve differences or contradictions, and set agendas for larger political bodies. This has been most famously implemented in Ireland when it was used to create laws around climate mitigation and human rights. Another example of expanding democracy is through the use of participatory budgeting. This photo is from New York City, but this has also been implemented in certain cities in California. And it's basically where the city residents can have a direct say over a portion of the city's budget. It might involve the facilitated and deliberative discussion with a smaller group of people, similar to how the citizens' assemblies work, or it can also include direct voting for specific budget line items. Next. Another crucial part of a degrowth transition would be expanding democracy into workplaces. So this would mean expanding worker co-ops or other type of worker-owned businesses. This would have the benefit of reducing inequality. Currently, CEOs have gone from making 20 times more than the average worker in 1965 to 400 times more in 2021. Worker-owned co-ops also have been shown to increase job satisfaction, which would improve personal well-being as well. Next slide, please.
So as Anne just alluded to, it is about empowering local communities to take ownership of resources. The systems in place that facilitate various forms of exchange and so on. It is ultimately about enhancing local agency. Serge Latouche, a prominent thinker in the degrowth movement, states that the localization theme in degrowth implies that all economic, political, and cultural decisions that can be made at the local level must be made at that level. Next slide. So perhaps one of the more prominent themes in degrowth tied to localization that is controversial and quite contradictory to contemporary economic characteristics is commoning. So commoning is essentially the idea and practice of self-governing shared resources and spaces instead of privatization. The emphasis within degrowth is that those resources and spaces that we all depend on should be held in common, and they should not be privatized by individuals and corporations for profit purposes. And that instead, communities should share in their stewardship. I think it's also easy to see how this would have anti-colonial implications. Instead of profit-driven corporations subverting democratic processes to begin resource extraction in or around a particular community, commoning would provide for more oversight and accountability by those most impacted by its use. And we can think about this here in the US, and we can also think about it on an international scale, where historically and perhaps even contemporarily, the global North is expropriating wealth from the global South through often violent and nefarious means. Next slide, please.
So here we get into more of the nitty-gritty of specific policy changes that could be implemented. So one, we want to reduce the amount of stuff we're producing. We would focus specifically on the most destructive sectors, such as fossil fuels, meat, especially beef, fast fashion, cars, aviation, etc. We would also want to move to a more circular economy by ending planned obsolescence, which could include, for example, passing laws to require electronics to have removable batteries, and then also implementing right to repair laws. We would want to curtail advertising and focus on removing subsidies and divesting from the most harmful industries. Next slide. We would also want to increase public services, especially ones that could contribute to our collective well-being. So this would be improving healthcare, education, housing, transportation, food, and we would also want to address income inequality through policies like maximum wages, progressive income taxes, taxes on inheritance, wealth, and luxury consumption. Next slide, please. And then another important aspect of the degrowth transition would be to address our understanding in relationship to employment. So this would include implementing a green job guarantee. This would mean that the government would implement works projects focusing on ecological restoration, climate mitigation, and resilience. This could end unemployment and provide for a just transition. And at the same time, we could also reduce working time through a 4-day work week, lowering the retirement wage, and increasing options for people who want to work part-time. Next.
So to conclude, we would like to recognize that fostering these themes and implementing some of the policy ideas degrowth offers, this might seem like a long shot, but I want to emphasize that there are already important movements toward deprioritizing economic growth and fostering systems that are healthier for people and the planet. As an example, the president of Ireland has outwardly condemned the obsession with economic growth. And there just this year was a conference in Brussels where thousands gathered, including political leaders, to explore what a post-growth economic system can look like. And the countries of Finland, Wales, Scotland, and New Zealand are using more holistic metrics as well to gauge well-being. And furthermore, I'd like to note that degrowth and SD 350 are aligned on many policy initiatives that you all undertake, such as advocating for renewable energy and reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. So we'd like to thank you for your engagement, and I hope you found some of this interesting and thought-provoking and perhaps informative for the work you all are doing at SD 350. Anne, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Sorry, no, we can move on. You can change the slide and we can move on to questions. Good. We thought that this would be like the more fruitful, like, because there were questions before we even started. So yeah, we can, and we can pull up slides again if people have questions about specific things.
Oh, thank you very much. Great presentation. Yeah, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can use the hand symbol, and then we'll get to you in order. So Steve, let's start with you.
Thanks. Yeah, wonderful presentation. Really, so many fantastic ideas. My question is about the curtail advertising. In the chat, I mentioned that obviously some people would attack this as totalitarian and free speech being suppressed. Scott responded that, of course, there are some things that we already don't allow, like marketing cigarettes to children, or marketing fentanyl or something like that. But could you talk about just curtailing advertising as a global idea, how you would go about that, and also what the rationale for it?
Well, I think the easy thing is the rationale is that we're in a system where, in order to like perpetuate itself, like we need to like produce and sell more. Like you need to, like, I think the common narrative is that or what companies want to say is like, oh, we're just producing what the public wants. And
Right.
Of course they're not. They're like creating desire and what they would say is need for these products. And so to kind of understand, I mean, I think, taking it to that level and kind of understanding like the underlying like, point of advertising and how it has this whole like history of manipulation in a lot of ways. And I think, yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone's saying like these things are necessarily easy. And I think advertising would probably absolutely have free speech issues. But you can maybe curtail like where the advertising is, and like cities have banned billboards, I mean, it's something small, but it's,
Right.
You don't have to necessarily think, okay, we're just going to get rid of all advertising everywhere. But try to
Just quickly, I mean, I think maybe the best approach is to be more specific to curtail advertising on the dangerous products that are destroying the planet. I mean, we shouldn't have advertisements for 9,000-pound SUVs, right? I mean, I think that's justifiable because there's a reason. But I think if you just argue curtail advertising, people won't understand it. So thank you.
No, it's an important clarification.
Yeah, and I just want to say one thing, Steve, that's a good point, because it leads me to believe too that we could actually utilize advertising for the things that encourage a more circular economy. I know Patagonia is doing some good work right now and trying to reuse a lot of the material that they're putting out there. So I don't think Degrowth would say there's no place for advertisement. It's just, like you said, kind of cutting back on these advertisements that lead to the production and consumption increasingly of these kind of environmentally and socially degrading items.
Elizabeth?
Yes. What is your position on pesticides and herbicides and degrowth? Have you thought about that?
I
Limiting it?
Sorry, I think a lot of degrowthers are against pesticide, and I mean, it's anything that's going to, I mean, that's part of the what's leading to the planetary boundary, some of the that nitrogen and phosphorus stuff has to do with agricultural use primarily, and novel chemical pollution as well. So yeah, that would not.
Yeah, and I have one more thing. Is this available? Are you going to send it to people who have participated? Because I would really like to send it to some people I know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's going to be made available.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
just, I would like to just say one thing regarding that question. As Anne said, there's definitely kind of this rejection of chemical intensive large scale farming. And at least from my perspective, and I think this is reflected in the literature quite a bit, degrowthers tend to lean more towards agroecological practices, which incorporate, environmental processes and the natural life in the area to increase yields. But yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? So I had a bit of a question, or at least a comparison that I've seen. So I went to Shenzhen not long ago, and it's a town in China just right across from Hong Kong. And it is now, it went from a city of 300,000 to 17 million people in 30 years. And if you go back 30 years ago, you will see basically 1 billion people in China on bicycles. But they went from bicycles to everyone, like not everyone, millions of people in cars. And then the pollution all the cities, I couldn't see through the cities, right? So the pollution was so extreme. The diabetes rates went through the roof. There was nowhere for the kids to exercise, and it became extremely dangerous to be outside because you're going to get run over. So that was an experience. I was really sad to see that American model of freeways and highways and everything being put into China. And it really, I think, has been an ecological, suicidal disaster. Plus the fact that most of what they're making is garbage. I mean, I kind of say garbage, but we're buying plastic stuff, which is, it's like the 50s smog in Los Angeles. So we already went through this, but the fact that there's 1 billion people doing it, and if we keep doing that, this infinite growth model, which is literally unsustainable, like it can't be sustained. We're just going to run out of everything, and we're just going to, the climate is just going to explode. I mean, this is a climate bomb. So I don't know if you talk about that, but I mean, it seems to me that would be an excellent example of where you could say, hey, if you went back, got rid of the cars, you put a bunch of people on bicycles, which are way cheaper, people will be so much healthier. Like immediately, they would be healthier. Like if you go to Europe, you go to Hamburg, if you go to Denmark, everyone's on a bicycle. And it really makes a difference in health, well-being, and price, and everything. And I think that's, just watching that happen is it just doesn't seem like an incredible, healthy environment. Do you see that as like that example seems to be it's kind of the flip side of what you guys are doing, but it was only 30 years ago that everyone was on a bicycle. So it's not like it has to be that way.
Yeah. I mean, Southern California is just perfect for it, right? Like we've got great weather for investing in an infrastructure that accommodates bicycles. And degrowth, they draw upon the work and the thought of Ivan Illich. I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with Ivan Illich, but he was a pretty prominent social critic in the past. And so much of the social kind of critique that comes out of degrowth is informed by Ivan Illich, and he had a lot to say about transportation, I believe, and kind of recognizing that it has the ability to surpass, these key thresholds that actually degrade social cohesion, our connection to the environment, and I think we're seeing the repercussions of it now.
There's a question in the chat. It says, are there any places in the world other than Bhutan that have implemented this degrowth principles?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And Dave has started that answer, which is, yeah, I mean, again, people don't like the word degrowth, so they're not calling it that necessarily, and they're not, no country, has come forward, with the exception of Bhutan, I think, has really come forward and said, yeah, we clearly want to move in an entirely different direction. But there are countries that have adopted, are part of the We All Alliance, so the Wellbeing Economy Alliance for governments. So that's the Scotland, Wales, New Zealand, Canada. I don't know if there's another one, Chad, Finland, that, are saying, like, we do at least need to shift to have the goal be different than, like, we really do want to focus on having a well-being economy. And the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is a great website, is a good resource as well. And then there are a lot of things happening at the city level around doughnut economics. So for people who are unfamiliar with this, it's basically, it started as a book, but it's basically this idea that we need to provide social well-being within planetary limits. So same kind of deal as degrowth. And there's a lot of co-work between people who are working in degrowth and doughnut economics. And so cities, Amsterdam being the most famous example, have kind of made this declaration to be a doughnut city. And what that means is implementing a lot of the policies that that we're advocating for. So a circular economy, public infrastructure for public transportation, like those kind of things.
Yeah, and Scott, maybe you have more to say about this, but I actually saw this recently too, that France, I believe, has restricted air travel between cities that are, I think, within like 2-hour train ride or car ride. I think it might be train ride. So that's another policy initiative out there that is, kind of, from our perspective, degrowth in action.
Yeah, the TGV is the fastest commuter train in the world, and it's fantastic. It's so efficient to move people that way. The train is just a little bit worse than the bicycle, but you can miss massive number of people in 2 hours. It makes absolutely no sense to get in an airplane to go between cities. But there's these cheap subsidized flights that goes. But I'd like to come back a little bit to your ecological thing, the doughnut principle. As a biologist, it's frustrating to see the amount of waste that we have. There's nothing in nature that's wasted, like zero. All of it gets turned back into something useful. And we've known this, indigenous people have known this forever. So we have an economic model that's only a few hundred years old that has led to extinctions of, almost all the beavers were killed, right? They had a huge impact on the Americas. We killed off all the tuna, we ate off all the fish on the coast. It's just eating everything. Right. But when you have nature, everything gets reused, everything comes back, everything is, and we could do this in a more artificial way where everything we make, everything we use, everything we produce, all comes back to its source, all is reused, all is, it's just a complete cycle. And that would mirror what we already know works sustainably in the world because it's been working for millions of years. Right. So I just feel like it's frustrating, but I feel like that's what the doughnut model is aiming towards. It's like a sort of industrial version of what really works in nature. Is that pretty much what you guys think?
Yeah, I don't know if I thought about it like that, but absolutely, so Kate Raworth was the author of that, and she was absolutely influenced by a lot of systems theory, which has this ecological grounding of exactly what you mean, that there's not there's not waste in nature. So yeah, she was definitely influenced by a lot of that, and she calls it a regenerative economy, which is is basically like a circular economy. Circular economy is a word that kind of gets I think it's subject to a lot of greenwashing. And so for some people, it just means like, I don't know, like not really circular, just less linear. But yeah, I think those are key pieces of our work.
We have a question in the chat from Paul. Does degrowth take a position on replacing fossil fuel production with wind and solar and still maintaining the same level of consumption?
Oh, that's such a great question. So the degrowth position is that you can't do that and still maintain the 2-degree target, or what, you know, or any reasonable target for climate change. So I think it, you know, it's obviously like, you know, to anybody, to degrowthers, like we do need to convert many of, you know, it's not like we're giving up all like electricity or energy, or have to move to, I don't know what, you know, so we have to like absolutely invest and grow the renewable energy industry. Absolutely. But as I think transportation team has like discussed this at length, right? It's like the answer can't be that everybody just continues to get into their individual car and you know, that's electric, right? That's great if people want to switch to electric. I mean, people do need to also do that, but it's not enough to just have technological innovation or switch to renewable energy. Yeah, I'm gonna chat if you want to.
We have another question. It's very long, but I'll try to think. Is there much discussion about the timing and prioritization of constraining elites, which use way disproportionate, I think this is the question, way disproportionate amount of their materials, and developing alternative ways of consumption? So for instance, like, you know, Taylor Swift takes 200 flights a year or something like that in a private jet to pick up groceries. You know, is there some talk about that?
Absolutely. So I think, yeah, there's, you know, so people who work in like around like aviation specifically would say like, okay, let's start with like banning private jets. Like there's just no, you know, or curtailing this use, or giving people like kind of the opposite of frequent flyer miles, where you have, you know, you have, it's rationed. I mean, basically bring back rationing for some items that are heavy. And also like, so, you know, making rules around what, you know, maybe banning private jets, but also like having luxury tax consumption, and also, you know, just having, you know, better economic equality would help that, because then, I mean, these people just have like literally have more money than they know what to do with. So of course they're going to spend it on things that are, you know, like just taking their, you know, taking a plane to do groceries. So absolutely, that's a big focus, I think. Sorry, Chad, do you want to add anything? Or?
No, I think that covers it.
Flying.
Yeah, the air travel is quite significant, as David Rice is pointing out. It is astonishing. It's just an astonishing use of resources.
There's a lot of things, I think, if you work in climate change, that keep you up at night. But one thing that really bothers me, or like this is that if you decarbonize everything else except for aviation, and then you say, okay, everybody, we're going to make it equitable. So everybody, and we're going to ration it globally. And so everybody gets like a 5-hour flight per year. Even if you do that, you still blow past our carbon budget for reaching, you know, so for reaching 1.5. So we're still like, flying is just, I mean, I think we think it's like, it doesn't, when you look globally, it doesn't make up a lot, because relatively few people fly globally, but then like per flight, it's just, it's just nuts. It's just, like I said, it keeps me up at night thinking about the flying.
One thing
Zoom, yeah.
yeah, you Zoom. No, I mean it's crazy. I work with scientists. We're supposed to know all the facts, right? And they still want to fly to DC for meeting each other so they can schmooze while they grade proposals of other scientists. It's like, you could do this on Zoom. It's annoying to have to think about this, but it would be more fair. More people could participate. It would be equitable. And it would save you thousands or tens of thousands of dollars per person that you can use for another grant. And there's a carbon footprint. It's nuts, but people are fixed in this. They can't even do the simplest things. It drives me absolutely up the wall.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask another question about ecofascism.
Oh, geez.
And I imagine these things come up in discussion. I can see you groaning. But I hear from my colleagues, some of them, like, well, it doesn't matter my carbon footprint because the problem is population. But when I look at the numbers, I'm thinking, well, it does matter your carbon footprint because you use 10,000 times more carbon than anyone in these other countries. Like they use almost nothing. So I'm wondering, but degrowth it seems like a lot of eco-fascists are like, well, we just have to get rid of people, which is just horrifying. But do they use these concepts in that way? And how do you guys deal with that?
So yeah, sometimes we do hear that. I think, yeah, just the facts don't bear this out, right? This is like, for one, we're actually in population decline all over the globe. Like, even, I mean, I think there's like 3 countries where the fertility rate is increasing, and it's like Kazakhstan and Mongolia. Like, everywhere else, no matter what it is currently it's going down. And it's going down globally. And then, as you say, like there's, when you have a differential, like when somebody in the global north is producing 40 times more carbon emissions than someone in the global south, and you say, okay, well, that means that person, like if their population was going to have an effect, they would be having 40 children per person, which is obviously impossible, and no one does it. It's just it's like, what are you talking about? Right? Like it's already, and like I said, it's already, and if you really want to address population, which again, I mean, I think that the key takeaway is that you don't have to do that. But if you do, then the answer is really, access to, reproductive freedom, access to education for women, like the things that we would want to have anyway, right? So it's not something we have to worry about. But then the answer is, if you really, I don't know, like the answer is not fascism or anti-migration or any horrible thing.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add one thing to that, and the reason why we included democracy in our presentation was because maybe for this reason, but the theme is in degrowth just unceasingly, and I think it's perhaps for this reason that many would be kind of tempted to come to the conclusion that the only way to do this is through kind of like drawing hard lines and forcing people. But within degrowth, I mean, it's got to be democratic all the way, and that might be a longer road, and we've got a kind of like a timeline, but it has to be democratic.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I would say that billionaire degrowth might be nice.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that this degrowth is not just an option, but it's a necessity, and I think educating people about that is the strongest way to persuade them. But we're so far away from that right now. I look at just the amount of waste, things that don't even benefit people. For example, if you go to a mall in Southern California on a hot day, right, and you walk past stores, the air conditioning is running full blast. The doors are wide open, and they're air conditioning the outside to be a magnet to get people to come inside. There's no reason. I mean, if you understand what's happening to the world, why would you ever permit something like that? And then the other part that always amazes me is how many people will just sit in their car with a motor running and eat their lunch or something. And they are putting out greenhouse gases, they're polluting the air. And there is, I mean, the raising the alarm seems to be so crucial to make progress in getting people to make changes. But I think the fact that we're so wasteful, in this society indicates how far we have to go.
Yeah, and I think, the US is kind of the epicenter of this growth earthquake that kind of took place and or that has taken place. And so the conversation has a long way to go in the US. But, I'm pretty optimistic because of, the things that are happening elsewhere, but also the things that are happening at a local level. I think there's a lot more engagement with different pathways to a more sustainable existence. But yeah, the conversation in the US, I think, will be particularly difficult to have, but it's definitely necessary.
So we did have plans to have breakout rooms. I don't know if we still want to do that, or do you
I
want
think my guess is that it's 7 o'clock, and I think people are we've had a lot of people leave, which is okay. But I think this is great discussion, and a lot of people have great questions. I think this is a good time to end. It's a perfect little video, 1 hour, and everyone was, the interaction was excellent. So that's my suggestion, though.
Hey,
Okay.
hey, Scott, could you put the definition of degrowth back up on the screen just before we end?
No, I can't do that, Mike, but someone else could.
I can go ahead and do that for you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a really interesting topic, and I think I can see people getting frustrated with the language, but I think we have to look beyond terminology to the, and it's a good one. It's a good one, but yeah, it's good. There you go.
See that?
Thank you. I'm going to copy it down now.
And I did put it in the chat, but yeah, I will actually right now put so this will be sent out, but for people who want to have it,
We should come up with a positive version of this, Anne. This is the first part. Democratic and equitable is really good. Reduction of abuses, but there's the flip side of this, which is what do you gain from it?
well-being.
Yeah, it's down here at the bottom. But there's a lot of well-being that could come from this, like cleaner air, cleaner water, more time with people, more time with your kids, more time with doing things that you actually want to do, and just having fresh fruit and vegetable. And there's a lot that having an easy way to get to another city that's cheaper, maybe having actual healthcare. We just don't have that stuff here.
Yeah, I mean, as a topic, it's very robust. There's a lot of components to it. There's a lot of research being done around it. It's very hard to know what to cut. I mean, I feel like I could do a whole other one that is still an intro, but just focuses on a whole bunch of other stuff. So, yeah, in the and yes to your question, Paloma. And then although most people have their camera off, so I don't know. But yeah, so I put the link to the slides in there, but they'll be sent to your email as well. And then the slides do have, there's some there's references and notes to each slide, and then I think on the last slide there's a list of books too, if people want to read more. Yeah, well, it's in the notes, but yeah, I can just copy it in there. You won't see it because you're just showing the
Hey, Anne, where did that definition come from?
It came from, I mean, I think I pieced it together in part, but it came together. I mean, yeah, it has elements that, I mean, this definition has kind of evolved over time, and people have said, you know, I think the core of it is the reduction in resource use. Like that's where it started. And then people said, but why? You know, what do we need? And so added like pieces. So I don't think it's a direct quote from anybody, but those are definitely.
So it's a Sheridan kludge?
Say that again?
It's a Sheridan kludge?
I'm not registering what that means. I don't know.
I mean, you put it together yourself.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't quite, if I like took it whole scale from one place, I would have quoted it. But it's also not fair to say I came up with this.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, some of these degrowth definitions that you'll find in some of the literature are pretty extensive too. So I think for readability, a more concise one was necessary.
Yeah.
Well, I really resonate with Scott's call for something positive. And of course, that's what the doughnut economics and the well-being economics is all about. But the thing that I keep coming back in is the golden rule. And love your neighbor as yourself. That pretty much gets us to degrowth, don't you think?
In our present situation, I think so.
I mean, we've got to have something inspiring other than this negative word degrowth.
Yeah. Well, that's why we said at the beginning. I mean, I think, yeah, there's a lot of debate about wording and messaging. Some people like the word degrowth because it can't be co-opted. You can't. There's no, like if you talk about a well-being economy, it's like that can mean so many different things to so many different people.
Exactly.
And it's like degrowth is like, no, we are very, you know, clear on what needs to happen. So I think it has that advantage, but it absolutely has disadvantages. And so I think, I mean, I think this is relevant to any climate work, is that you have to speak different dialects for different audiences. And so if you just see like, I'm going to use this, you know, we called it degrowth because this is what is called, you know, the IPCC uses this term, you know, this is the most popular term in the media is degrowth. But you know, that's not a word I would use if I'm like advocating for a policy like at the city council, you know, forget it.
Well, the other common word is simply sustainability.
Yeah. Living within limits. Yeah. I think there is an opportunity for degrowth to kind of cut across some of that, the polarization that we see too.
Well, thank you all so much for having us. It's been a pleasure. So
yeah.
Thank you too.
And feel free to reach out to us, especially like we meet as Degrowth California. So if you're interested, you can email us and we'll send you a meeting invite. And yeah, but even if you have any questions like, oh, I didn't understand this. This is my degree, so I'm happy to answer all questions at any time. It helps me. So
did you put your emails in the chat?
They're in the slideshow.
Oh, okay.
And I put a link to the slideshow in the chat, but then you'll get the slideshows again.
Thank you.
But thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Great. Yes. Thank you, everyone. Like we mentioned before, you will be getting a follow-up email with the slide and the recording once it's up on our YouTube channel for you to check out and share with anybody. If you have any other questions, thank you, Anne, and thank you, Chad, for being here. And also feel free to like reach out to them. We'll have their email there. And we have quite a few climate chats booked now until January. So join us every month for a different topic. For you to engage with a couple of things that our teams are planning. And if you have something that you would like to see in a future climate chat and would like to lead into, please go ahead and let us know at volunteer@San Diego 350, and we can go ahead and get you connected. But yeah, I hope that you have a good rest of your night and drink lots of water. It's hot.